right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos, and I am joined by Father Hans Jacobse today. How are you doing today, sir? Can you hear me?
Yes.
How are you doing today?
Hang on. I'm getting a loop here from what you just said.
Oh, do you have your web browser open? You may be hearing the stream while also hearing we're probably 20 15 seconds ahead of the actual video.
This,
Can you hear me now?
yeah, but it's like two people talking, but this is in my web browser. It's supposed to be a standalone.
No, it can be in your web browser. I didn't know if you were playing the YouTube video. You don't need to play the YouTube video. That's what I was saying. You may hear an echo because the
That was
YouTube
it.
Video.
Sorry, that was it. We're all set. I didn't realize. I just closed that tab. I forgot. Okay.
Yeah. No worries. No worries. How you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you doing,
Great.
Patrick?
I'm great. And, I wanted to let people know I had the pleasure of meeting you recently that our sister parish. So I go to a small church here in central Indiana, and we would consider the big sister, St. George, very, very beautiful Byzantine style parish. And you were the keynote speaker for a men's retreat that recently occurred. And I was able to attend and meet you in person. And that was a real highlight and a real blessing. And you had some very powerful and important things to say, specifically regarding your ministry for men. And so today's stream, I wanted to kind of hit, hopefully, God willing, many of the high points of your speech and a lot of your work, and also allow people that are watching live right now to send in some questions and maybe get your perspective on some of the things that men are dealing with. I know you've done a lot of spiritual work for men that are dealing with addiction, pornography addiction, most specifically. And I know that many people are still struggling with that. And so people can feel free to send in some questions or comments throughout our conversation, but wanted to really introduce your work. I'm also Antiochian, so the Amen group. I know that we've been inspired in our men's group at our parish with some of the stuff that you guys are doing. So I guess to get into the conversation, I was wondering if we could begin, because we were talking backstage a bit, if you could get into your journey becoming Orthodox, because you're also a convert, like many of the people are going to be listening to this stream. The vast majority of my audience is American or Canadian or Australian or British, and most of them are converting, specifically young men. So before we get into kind of spiritual warfare and a lot of the nitty gritty of our conversation today, could you speak to how you became Orthodox and how your journey into becoming a priest?
Well, the search for Christ was an arduous one and a painful one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and but I found Christ. I won't get into the details about that, but it's a profound crisis of meaning to start with, and then it was just the descent into dark places. And I don't mean like, okay, I got into a lot of sin or something like that. It was deeper than that. It was just a complete existential darkness. And it really took a miracle to pull me out of that. But all it took was a prayer. But that's all it took, But I went through a year of hell, and I mean, really hell. But it's so disconnected, and it took me about 3 years to heal from that. But I found Christ. I dropped out of college because of that, and I just worked for about 3 years. So it took me about 3 years to heal from that. It was with a group of Christians, and at least learning some basic life skills and stuff like that. I mean, not that I was a slouch, I never was, but everybody knows what I'm talking about because everybody these days goes through it. And then went back to college, and I was really disenchanted with the Christianity I saw. But I just thought I'm just not going to go to church anymore. It's primarily evangelical. I went and checked out the Newman Center on campus. It just wasn't for me. The ethos of it. I don't fit here. I don't belong here. And then I've always been interested in culture and history. And my friends used to laugh at that, but they kind of respected it. But I'll give you an example. Like when I got married, my friend said, "We got to give you a bachelor party," and we went out to a park and roasted hot dogs and talked about the decline of the West. That was my. I really wanted to understand it because I could sense the decay around me, right?
Right.
And you guys are better educated than I was because there's so much more out there. But it was nihilism. It
Right.
really was. I mean, fell headlong into that. Thought I could figure it out for myself. You can't. You can't. It brings you to disintegration on the inside. And I watched this disintegration, and I felt like I was splitting apart. But Christ pulled me out of that. But it took me a long time to really understand what had happened and where the world was going. And then I came across Solzhenitsyn,
Mm.
Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and I read his Harvard address. He gave an address in 1978, and I found the address in the school library. I read it, and as soon as I read it, I said, I sensed it, the deep spiritual wells he was drawing from, and his analysis of culture, which I've been trying to figure out ever since I was in high school, right?
Hmm.
How things really worked. And that then it was so profoundly Christian. This was the depth I was looking for. I mean, my heart just like leaped. And so I started reading him, read everything he wrote. And I came across a book called From Under the Rubble, which he brought all these Samizdat thinkers together, Christians, on how to rebuild Russia after communism fell. Communism was still there,
Right.
okay. And I was in college during the Reagan years,
Oh, okay.
and I was the only conservative. I only knew one conservative on campus, and I'm sure there were more, but they were intimidated. It was a very liberal campus, the University of Minnesota. But I used to like arguing with the Marxists. I used to like that. I felt like I was doing something good for humanity, but I was, I
True,
was,
you were.
I just confronted them, and
Unfortunately, all those Marxists are still there.
I know it was at that time. It was the only university with a course, an accredited course taught by a devout Marxist. So I took the course, right, and I would challenge the professor. And I would ask him, how come we don't read Solzhenitsyn in this class? And I really, anyway. And then that led me to the discovery of Orthodoxy.
Right.
Okay. And I began, well, what is this faith? Right. And I started learning about Orthodoxy. And I was telling all my friends, and they thought I was just on another thing. Right. And and then I met this girl, and I told her about my great discovery, and she goes, I'm Orthodox. I go, what? I thought Orthodox churches only existed in Russia, right? And she was Greek Orthodox, and she was in grad school at the time in history, American history, and so she, good grad school student, she wasn't going to church, but she started going back to church, and I started going with her, and then we got married.
Oh,
So,
glory to God.
yeah, it was like 35 years ago, and that's but for me, it was really profound. I could not have settled for anything else
Hmm.
because, now I understand it. At the time, I didn't. It was like a huge discovery for me, and and so in relating to the men's work here, it's that experience of that deep isolation. I, that doesn't describe it. It was like a descent into hell,
Right.
and and we saw demons and all that stuff. That was bad, and that's where
Right.
the inner disintegration leads you to. There were reasons why it got that bad, but that's something that's never left me. That part of my experience, and that's a lot of that is what compels me to do the work I'm doing now, because I see a lot of guys going through exactly the same thing.
Right.
And what I do a lot is you know, some of the guys coming into the church, they come in with those wounds. They come
Right.
in with those wounds. Baptism is the beginning of the healing, but
Right.
I help them heal. That's what I do.
When did your men's work get going?
Well, I've always done it kind of on and off, but about 12 years ago, I was starting a mission parish at that time. It's the parish I'm in now. We're flourishing, but I started a mission parish. I left the Greeks and I went to the Antiochians and started a mission parish. And a 23-year-old guy in my parish was in a car accident with a traumatic brain injury, multiple skull fractures and everything. And I got the text from his mom. Jeremiah's in the hospital, and he's been in a bad car accident. So I went down to the hospital. I was the first one there. Actually, I beat the family. And there he was lying on the gurney in the emergency room. And I could tell this was like really, really serious. They didn't take him off the gurney. And I could look at the faces of the nurses. And I knew this was bad. And then his family came in and they all looked at me. They all looked at me. And I looked at them and I said, this is a real desperate situation. But in desperate times, we pray to God. And we're going to pray and ask God to save your brother. And I did. I said the healing prayers and anointed them. And in the prayer, I heard he's going to be okay. But I didn't know if that was me or if that was really the Lord. I didn't know because
Right.
I really loved him. I really loved him. I still do. He's like 32 now. I really loved him. And I just told God, I'm not going to let him die. I know that sounds audacious, but I vowed I'm going to do everything to keep this man alive. And because I didn't want him to die.
Right.
And but I didn't know if that was the Lord or not. And I didn't know what that vow, that promise would entail. So we're done praying, and his brother, his younger brother, 19 years old at the time, he's about 30 now. So Jeremiah must be about 34 now. He came up to me and he says, Father, he's going to be okay. He's going to be okay. And when I heard that, I went, oh, it's the Lord who was speaking to me. Okay. And I looked at his mother, who's a nurse, and knew exactly what the injuries were. I looked at her. I said, Patty, that's the mom's name. I said, I think he might be okay. And she looked at me like afraid to hope, right? 2 days later, I'm at the trauma center because they brought him to the trauma center in Fort Myers, and his little brother was there. And I said, how did you know? How did you know that where did that come from? Now, this I'm going to say his name, Cliff. Okay. He said, Father, I don't know. Keep in mind that the only time he was in church when he was baptized Catholic as a baby. Never went to church since. I mean, completely secularized in the sense of a completely caught up in the incipient nihilism of the culture.
Right.
And struggled and suffered. Okay. He says, see, now I can never say this without crying because it's so profound. I can't. Every time I say this, tears come to my eyes. And he says, Father, I don't know, but when you were praying, I asked God to take me instead of him. And I was taken to heaven and I came back down. And that was the beginning of his conversion. And I catechized him and baptized him about a year later. But he was my first because I loved this kid too. I just loved him, right? And I could see what he was crawling out of. I could see what had laid hold on him. This nihilism, man, it's from the devil. It's from the devil. It really is. And you know, I could see the woundedness. I could see the struggle. You know, all that. And he was my first. He was my first. And me and him just grew really close. kind of started guiding him, you know. And then more men just came into my life with different issues, different problems. And then Father Patrick Henry Reardon, Antiochian priest, he's basically retired now, but really beautiful man, heard what I was doing, and he said, could you come up and give a talk at a Touchstone conference, Touchstone magazine? I said, yeah, I'll do that. And it was the first time I ever went public with this. And then all the problems that men have. You mentioned the porn. That's a big issue. We can talk about that later if you want.
Right.
Okay. But there's actually, you know, a lot of guys were struggling with that. How to help guys get out of that, right? Well, there's a methodology to it I've developed that's really, this is going to sound audacious. It's going to sound audacious, but it was given to me by St. Maximus the Confessor, right? And it's a different anthropology in overcoming addictions. And it works. And so I went up and I wrote a talk called Pastoring Young Men into Manhood. And the reception astonished me. The reception was so positive about it that I realized, that's only then that I realized that, oh, I've got something really powerful here. I had no idea.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happened then was they put it on their website, and it was the only video that was free. Everything else was behind a paywall. Well, that video, it's still on YouTube somewhere. That video started as a slow viral, and all these men started calling me from all over the country, and I would ask them. I said, "Well, what is it about that video that compelled you to call me?" They were struggling with pornography, and they said, "It's when you said what it really is misplaced creativity." That rung a bell in every man's heart that called me. Okay, and that's Orthodox anthropology. Like I say, we can get into that later. And then out of that, a priest and a deacon said, "We want to come and see you," and they came and saw me. They said, "You got to start an organization." Well, I didn't know if that was a good idea or not. I mean, I've started a lot of stuff that has fizzled, and I thought, it takes a lot of work, right? And so I went to Greece that summer, and I met Dimitri. Dimitri was a friend of Jeremiah, and we connected during his accident. This was about 6 years before. And it was Dimitri who taught me about, at that time, Elder Paisios. Because the one who effected the miracle, by the way, in Jeremiah, it was the complete recovery. It was. Wow. And it was through Elder Paisios. I've written a little narrative on this. I could find it and we'll put it in the chat or something. So Dimitri has a real interesting story. When Elder Paisios, when he was at the monastery in Suruti, the village outside of Thessaloniki, that's where he spent the last of his days, and he's buried there. There was a woman in the village who could not have children. She always miscarried. And Elder Paisios got a call from somebody, said, "There's a child up for adoption. Do you know anybody who could adopt him?" And that child was Dimitri. Yeah, I mean, it's just so beautiful, so beautiful. So Dimitri was raised by Elder Paisios. He would call him Papu, which means grandfather, right? And so he has a real connection with him. And he emailed me and said that, I didn't know him at the time. He emailed me through Jeremiah's sister and said, "Elder Paisios has healed many young men in car and motorcycle accidents in Greece." And I wrote him back. I said, "Tell me what to do." And he told me what to do, and I did it. And lo and behold, he performed a miracle with Jeremiah. So this is the first time now going to Greece that Dimitri Dimitri and I met. And so he said, well, we're going to go to some monasteries, which was fine with me. My daughter, my wife, they stayed in Thessaloniki, and me and Dimitri went and visited different monasteries. Walked into one. I don't even know which one it was. Okay. And I walked into one. This really happened. The elder of the monastery sees me. I did not know he was the elder at the time, but he sees me, and he walks right up to me, and he says to me in Greek, he says, "You will lead many young men in America into the Orthodox Church, and Elder Paisios, he's Saint Paisios now, but Elder Paisios and the Theotokos are going before you."
Wow.
And it went right through me. And then I went, oh, I better go back and start the project. So I did. And that's now the Brotherhood of St. Paisios.
Wow. That's an amazing story, and how it's really a calling. I mean, in a sense, you've been called to do this work. And before we get into, you mentioned some of the things that young men are struggling with right now, but before we get into any of the specifics, or some of the spiritual advice you would give them on how to address some of their addictions and the spiritual warfare against them, I thought maybe you could speak to the masculinity crisis. So you're talking about the nihilism in Western civilization, and the degradation that's before all of us. But young men, especially if they're going through school right now, they're being told that there's a masculinity crisis in regards to what we would consider traditional masculinity. So men are aggressive, men are defensive, and this is considered the masculinity crisis. It's sort of remolding what a man should be, being more emotional, and stuff like that. But then we're seeing a response with the red pill and the manosphere movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wanting to get your perspective on what is the masculinity crisis, from your perspective as an Orthodox priest, maybe the differences between how the secular world defines what a man is, and how you as an Orthodox priest would define what a man is, and what he should be in relation to Christ.
Well, to be a man, a masculine man, is to be who God created you to be. It's the goal. Okay, so Christ was the perfect man. Christ was who he was. Oh, Father, he was God too, but he presents himself as a man.
Right.
Okay, he presents himself as a man, and what does he do? He does the will of the Father, and that's what we have to do. Well, how do we do that? Well, we've got to start. We've got to start by healing up. We've been indoctrinated. We believe lies. We got to start. We got to start purifying our minds, and we have to cleanse our heart. So the way I look at the masculinity crisis, I mean, I see it, as a pathology that requires healing. But if I take a deeper view, I think it comes from the depths of hell, man. I think it comes from the depths of hell. And here's what I think is going on a subterranean level. I think the devil, he tried to kill Christ. I mean, in when you look at it, especially St. John Chrysostom's sermon that we read on Pascha, hell received a body but encountered the face of God. And I think what happened is then the realization that they have been defeated came to them full force. I think that part of the destruction of death and the power of the devil was to deceive the deceiver. That's what happened. The deceiver himself was deceived because he believed that if he could bring him into Hades, he would be captive there forever.
Right.
Okay. But the perfect man can't be held by death. Now I'm thinking in terms of the Apostle Paul. All right. How do we know that Jesus was righteous according to the law? The promise of the law was that if a man was righteous, that is, he lived according to the dictates of the law, he would live forever.
Right.
All right. Because that's how God would live if God were a man.
Right.
And that's what man was to aspire to. Well, we know he was righteous because he rose from the dead. We know he was righteous because according to the law, because rising from the dead means that the sentence of death was not upon him. This is the way that Paul reasons in Romans. Okay, this is how he reasons in Romans. And so the devil, so to speak, has no jurisdiction over him.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, why now is he attacking masculinity? Because he wants to destroy fatherhood.
Right.
All right. So, and if he can destroy fatherhood, then he can obliterate the memory of God the Father from the dominant culture. That's what I think is going on a deep subterranean spiritual level. The devil wants to destroy the notion of fatherhood. Then God just becomes a singular monad in the sky, untouchable.
Right.
Untouchable. There is no possibility of redemption and personal communion with him. There's only what? Well, you just decide. Every religion has a different answer. All right?
Right.
That's what I think is going on. And in order to destroy man, he had to destroy women first. And I think feminism is a big part of that, especially the central tenet that abortion is a natural good. Well, what destroys a woman's, sense of her own femininity than to devalue what she brings into the world, which is new life.
Right.
All right.
A unique gift that women can offer. So
yes.
Yeah.
Well, life comes into the world through the woman.
Right.
Right. And that's devalued, that's diminished, but even more tragically, that a woman who has an abortion, and I don't point at them in a political or polemical way, I'm not doing that, because the reality is a lot of women have abortion now because they feel trapped because men don't support them anymore, right? And it becomes a vicious circle. This is what happens. And so the woman loses her sense of femininity, right? And that's a way to devalue men as well. And that's what's happening. The whole goal is to destroy masculinity and to destroy men.
Right.
Okay. Now, look at it from that point of view, and the necessity to rebel against that destructive lie that men are not to be men comes into clear focus.
Right.
So, and being now, see, here's what happens is that, when you're born, then you enter the teenage years, and teenage years is when you wake up to the world. But you make the assumption that what you see is the way it's always been and the way it's going to be.
Right.
Right. But there's this nihilistic strain in the culture, and this pandering to every passion ends up handicapping the boy, and the path to sound character, to sound manhood, is nowhere to be found.
Right. Yeah. Well, when you were talking about the perniciousness of feminism, the immediate thing I did a stream comparing kind of the ideals of the modern feminist to the Theotokos, and you see virginity being attacked. That you look at TikTok, at least the influencers, the ones that are getting the views, they're advocating for young girls to gain sexual experience, religious purity, religious devotion, modesty is under attack. And then, of course, motherhood and these things that are unique to what we would consider a pious feminine woman. All of these things are being degraded. And you're speaking about fatherhood and the attack on fatherhood. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on this metaphor I use. Is I in describing masculinity, I've discussed it as like the castle walls, and that masculinity by definition forms boundaries. And those boundaries are, when they're crossed, has led to war throughout history, but it has to do with men establishing cultural, moral, religious boundaries and trying to obtain and uphold them. And what we're seeing today is the dissolution of all boundaries, male, female, man, animal, man and machine, all the boundaries that exist. These ontological boundaries are being dissolved. And this is really the perniciousness of evil. And so I say that men are the castle walls, women, children are the jewels within the castle walls. And as men have lost the religious and divine foundations of their own identity, those walls are becoming decrepit. They're falling down, and the evil one can then penetrate those walls and then ransack the things that are most valuable, which is the innocence of children and the purity and righteousness of women.
Yeah.
So
Look,
go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, let me sharpen that up a little bit.
Okay.
Okay. The cultural walls are being demolished. The cultural walls of Christendom are being demolished. Okay. Not the ontological. The ontological you can't change.
Agreed.
Okay. But I'm just making a point here because the ontological walls, the way that reality is really constructed, is fixed.
Right.
It's fixed. So men, the closer you draw to God, and the more you put off the sin in your own life, and you conform your lives to reality as it is, like Saint Ephraim the Syrian, that we might live according to God's grand design, the more you're going to find the grace to succeed. Because that's where the grace flows. That's
Right.
where the grace flows. That's the purpose of grace, so that you might step more deeply into reality. So how do we resist this? I used to be a cultural warrior for a while, and I applaud what they do. I mean, I applaud what they do. But I realize that that's not where I'm supposed to work. I'm supposed to work where I'm working now, right? But guys, I tell you that this can turn around. You can turn around. And in your turning around, right, you will affect the world around you profoundly.
No, I absolutely agree with that, and I agree with you in regards to the ontological reality is not being dissolved. It's the cultural perniciousness that is convincing people that these boundaries are being dissolved or that they should be dissolved.
Mm-hmm.
And as I kind of mentioned to you backstage, men are in this vicious feedback loop because they are clinging to their passions. That, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. I've said this to a few priests, but in regards to a sort of pattern that we're seeing with the fall of Adam and Eve, the devil first tempts the woman. And the
Mm-hmm.
woman then abides by the temptation. She eats the apple. But creation doesn't fall yet. It isn't until Adam listens to the woman and disobeys God.
Yeah.
And then creation falls. And so this pattern of men conforming to the wishes of women, and not just, I'm not trying to be, again, polemical or antagonistic towards women, but men, at least from our Orthodox Christian faith, their eyes need to be directed towards God. And from that, things will correctly then fall into place and the ordering of reality will maintain. But
Mm-hmm.
men are not having their eyes on the transcendent deity and instead are being led by the opportunity of sex or sexual attention. And we've mentioned backstage about the promiscuity of young women right now. So we live in a culture where this Jezebel spirit, Jezebel, the wife of King Ahab, got
Mm-hmm.
Israel to go back to Baal worship, the sacrificing of children. You mentioned abortion. And
Yeah.
so we see that was the biggest issue for women, right? I think in America, it was like 70% of women thought abortion was like the biggest issue of this recent election cycle. And I can't help but see these same patterns these biblical patterns being playing itself out in the present day.
Yes. Well, you see it in the churches that have women priests. Within 10 years, they're in the deepest sexual confusion. Look at the Episcopalian Church.
Right.
Or look at the churches that become homosexualized. Look, if something gets homosexualized, it's going to become feminized. If something gets feminized, it's going to become homosexualized. And it's because it's a degradation of anthropology at its core. Okay. So, if an institution gets homosexualized, right, you're going to have all sorts of aberrations, and you're going to have the victimization of children by men. Okay. If it gets feminized, then what's going to happen is you're going to fall into just lesbianism, homosexualism, right? Because there's a reason for this. I can get into the reason if you want me to.
Yeah, please.
Well, if you have a woman priest, right? Look, God's creativity is replicated in the creation. okay, that the way that the creation works is a reflection of God. Now, the creation is not God because God spoke the world into existence, right? All the other religions, have God, apart from Islam, but Islam is a derivative of Judaism, Christianity. Ultimately, it's Arianism fundamentally. Right. But I don't want to get too much into that. But that would be the exceptions. All other religions have the creation coming out of the stuff and substance of the God.
Right.
Okay. Or God's plural. Right. So, but in a Christian context, you have a woman creates the new life. All life comes from the woman. Even when the sperm hits the egg, the sperm cell dies. The only thing that is exchanged here is the code. That's it. So our flesh and blood, our body and blood come from our mothers. Okay? What is the new birth and baptism, but what is the life in the chalice? The body and blood of Christ. Now that's replicated by the female in the order of the creation, okay? But the nature of the life is the same.
Right.
Okay? Now you put a woman priest up there holding up a chalice, you have a complete symbolic collapse, not a metaphorical collapse, a symbolic collapse. In Greek, the word is symbolos. The symbol is a place where two realities come together.
Right.
Okay? The created and the uncreated, they meet in the symbol. In this case, the symbol of the Eucharist.
Right.
Now we hear symbol, we think metaphor, but we got to think like Greeks.
Right.
Okay? No, it's the point of contact between the created and the uncreated. When you have, by the way, the opposite of symbolos is diavolos.
Yeah, the divider.
See the connection? The liar, the one it means the one who separates. How does he separate? Through the lie. A lie tears at the very fabric of reality. That's what it does. And when men, I'm going a little far afield, but when men believe a lie, that lie functions inside them as if it were the truth, and that's how evil enters the world. Satan can lie, but he can't bring evil into the world. Only men can. But the evildoers are the ones who believe a lie, and then that lie functions as the truth. That's how evil enters the world. Anyway, back to the woman priest. So there she is, holding up the chalice, and you have two modes of creation there. The creation within creation, the woman who gives birth, okay, and then you have the creative prowess of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ through the chalice.
Right.
And it collapses. They collapse, and once you collapse, all sexual distinctions collapse with it.
Right.
That's why you can't have women priests. That's why all the pagan religions had women priests. Right. And they were fornicating on the altar.
Yep.
Okay. We're talking about the ontological structure of the creation. This is what we're messing with. And the people, there's some in Orthodoxy who say we should have women priests, and they use all the progressive logic, right. Okay, which is basically just Marxist power mechanics. That's all it is. It's unfair. It's unfair. It has nothing to do with fairness. It has everything to do with the representation and the living inside of ontological reality. We don't mess with this stuff.
Right.
Anyway, where were we going with that,
Patrick? Well, you're tying things in regards to the transgression of boundaries and femininity, the collapsing of the symbol.
Right. And so, the whole masculinity crisis is that what's being attacked here is the whole notion of maleness. Now, let me say something else. And this gets a little abstract, but it's really important. One of the loves of God towards mankind is called eros, divine eros. Mm-hmm. And that's God's creative potency. That's replicated in creation too, with sexuality. Because the purpose of sexuality is what? It's the creation of new life.
Right.
In that sense, it replicates something of God. We see something of God in the creation. Now, that is where men get hit hard with the porn, with the sexuality. It's just everywhere,
Right.
right? But the reason that is because if that can get distorted in man, he'll lose his creative potency. That's what'll happen. You know, you hear in the culture about failure to launch. When I hear failure to launch, I hear a guy who's addicted to porn. And he's honestly,
Yeah.
he's masturbating all the time. What's he doing when he does that? Well, what he's doing is he's draining out all his creative energy. Okay, that's what's going on. And well, why does this happen? Well, because there was no one to guide him. There was no man in his life to guide him on the manly path when he was growing up. That's
Right.
what's going on. So this crisis of manhood is rooted in a crisis of fatherhood. And every successive generation it gets worse. I have a theory on that. I think it happened because of World War II. You know, I'm into this cultural stuff. I don't know if this theory is right or not, but you know, Europe reached spiritual exhaustion in World War I. It reached complete spiritual exhaustion. That was the rise of the avant-garde.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you mentioned something about the Theotokos and women. I
Yeah.
wrote an essay on this once. It's a good essay. But I compared Picasso to an icon of the Theotokos. And Picasso's cubism was just, he was taking the disfragmentation of his own soul towards the female and putting it on canvas.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he was doing. And you could see the devolution throughout his career as a very promiscuous man, serial adulterer. So his life serves as proof of my thesis.
Right.
Okay. But you look at how he sees woman, and he can only see woman as a fragmented object and an object of sensuality. You compare that, put that side by side with an icon, a beautiful icon of the Theotokos, and you can begin to perceive what that fragmentation really is. And then also, and this is what's frightening, you realize that you can relate to the fragmentation more than you can with the Theotokos. Well, of course we can. We're all recovering materialists.
Right.
It's kind of like when you read Notes from the Underground, you know, and you relate with the main character, or Crime and Punishment. You understand Raskolnikov. You know, that's a real uncomfortable feeling, but that's what we're coming out of, right? That's what we're coming out of.
Right.
So, so men, really adopt the disciplines of the church. That's my advice. Look, they talk about toxic masculinity. There's no such thing as toxic masculinity.
Agreed.
There's only toxic people. And toxic people are both male and female. That's
Right.
just a polemical trick, you know, to make you feel defensive, to make you feel weak. Don't buy it. Just don't buy it. Okay. It's not a legitimate, it's not even a legitimate cultural category, right? It's certainly not an
Agreed.
ontological category. It's
Right.
not a legitimate cultural category either. But
Right.
this thing about divine eros, let me get back on that. The way a man heals from porn, and St. Maximus the Confessor, I got this from him. And I know I got it from him. I'll tell you how. Because after I developed it, it started with when he said, all desire, even inordinate desire, the sinful desire, is grounded in a desire for God. So I thought, you know, this is just something that's gone off astray,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And it's become habituated, in some cases compulsive, right? But if it's grounded in the desire for God, then it started out as good. So what happened? What happened? It usually happens in adolescence. What happened is that man has a natural creative prowess. And we've all experienced this. When you've done a job, you've done something, and you've done a task, you've done a job, and you've done it well. Your soul is gratified.
Right.
Why? Because you're actualizing your own manhood. That's why. You know, men are there to build, defend, protect. And you talk to any guy who's got, some sense left, and it just resonates in him, these words and this kind of encouragement. Okay? If a guy mocks you for it, it's because he's sacrificed his manhood on the altar of feminism.
Right.
Or he's so dissipated he can't muster any natural energy anymore. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
But so, man, instead of, the teenage years, it's the years of growing from childhood into adulthood. But the lack of fatherhood means that most of us don't have mentors.
Right.
Right? And because fatherhood is diminishing from generation to generation, because I didn't make this point, I didn't finish this point, but because I think the guys, the men from World War II came home so traumatized by that war, because war traumatizes. But then right away, the Hollywood propaganda machine came out with all their movies about the great American hero.
Right.
It was never dealt with. I think these men came home severely wounded. It was never dealt with. Okay, so the boys grew up without the training and the example and the experiences that they needed. The reason I think that is because the whole 60s rebellion really started in 1965. That's only 20 years after World War II.
Right.
And okay, so they grow up and they have children, and their fathering is weaker. And then the generation after that, which is where you guys are at, the fathering's even weaker. Now, this isn't universally true, but it's so broadly true, I can make a generalization like I do, right? And so the boy growing up, he has this desire inside of him, to succeed, to build, to grow, figure out who he is, to meet the challenges. All men do. But he doesn't have a guide, he doesn't have an encourager, and he meets frustration after frustration after frustration. Meanwhile, thanks to O Diavalos, right, all this pornography is there, and it gets channeled into the sex drive, which is also a creative drive, but it hyperinflates the sex drive. And what he's looking for in the orgasm is actually that gratification that comes through the accomplishment, real accomplishment through work. That's what I think is going on.
No, and
right?
I think I totally agree with that. One, from my own struggles previously with porn until I was able to get that under control was, one, you never feel good afterwards, but you can feel a sort of dissipation of creative energy. So I noticed I would get most tempted when I needed to sit and read and really focus on something or write a paper. A lot of my work is intellectual or academic. So whenever I really have to focus on something, then I get bombarded with the mental images and the temptations and the passions. And you think, oh, well, I'll just do it real quick and then I'll get back to work, and those things will leave me. But then once you participate in that sin, you can feel you have less energy to actually accomplish your goals now. You have less energy to actually go and make something happen. And that, to me, this is all part of a spiritual problem that is weakening men and failing to. So even the pornography is it's a shortcut to what would they think is going to be a sexual satisfaction, but typically that release, that orgasm, comes from doing things in the world, having some type of social status, meeting a woman, building a relationship, and then eventually having sex. And so there is a journey there. And people are skipping that journey and trying to just get the satisfaction of sex. And it builds this nasty feedback loop where they don't, like you said, a failure to launch. They don't use their creative energies to actually do difficult things, which also decreases their testosterone, which makes it less enjoyable to do difficult things.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, um, it it also creates a sense of inadequacy and deficiency in the boy. And you know, he's doing this and he's thinking, well, when I get to be 17 or 18, I'm going to quit.
Right.
Then he finds out he can't. That sense of deficiency often arises in the presence of women, because it's a sense of masculine deficiency. He's
Mm,
not as strong as he wants to be. Okay. I always tell guys, I deal with guys a lot with this issue. I always tell them, look, if you have a sense of deficiency, I'm real upfront about stuff like this. I said, well, you know, you should be grateful, because underneath it there is a sense of sufficiency. Otherwise, you wouldn't feel deficient,
right.
right? What we got to do is we got to heal the wounds, and we got to apply the disciplines in your life to where those things can be healed, and you can grow and blossom into full manhood.
Right.
And they do. When they what There's a false promise with masturbation. And even though a guy knows it's false, he'll do it anyway, which is that, oh, the orgasm will make me feel whole, will make me feel like a man. But that's only for marriage and your wife, okay? If you rip it out of that context, what's going to happen is exactly what you described. It's a sense of depletion.
Right.
I tell guys, you know, you're flushing all your creative energy down the toilet is what you're doing, literally what you're doing. Now, what happens is once the discipline is starting to be applied, and we do this in this course I designed, it's called Achieving Sexual Integrity, almost immediately their masculine power starts to return. And one of the first manifestations of that, this is when they're really putting off the masturbation, the porn use. Porn, I got to tell you, with porn, people say I'm addicted to porn. No, you're not. You're addicted to masturbation. You use porn as a masturbation accelerant.
Right.
Okay. It's just so you can masturbate more and quicker because you get aroused faster,
Right.
right? You don't really have to self arouse, right? Just watch the porn and it'll arouse you. That's
Right.
really what happens, right? Um, but once they lay that aside, apply the orthodox ascetical self discipline, which is geared towards ontological reality and the strengthening of the man. That's why we fast. That's why we pray. Then one of the first things that happens is that his mind gets sharper.
Yep.
And often they don't notice that, but I'll ask them, how's your thinking? Is it clearer? And they go, yeah. They realize, yeah, I'm thinking a lot more clearly. Yeah, because you're not dissipating your energy. You're using it in the way that God intended and God created.
Right. Could you speak to regarding spiritual warfare? I've brought up and read some of the saints talking about the logismy and
Hmm.
that it's orthodox. And I found that this is actually a great apologetic tool for people coming out of the New Age and the occult because they place so much emphasis on the imagination as being this spiritual dimension within man. And obviously, you getting to the anthropology, our understanding of the nous and our noetic faculties. Certainly, we're not New Age, but we do believe that we don't have some separate understanding of mind. The nous is part of the soul. The nous is the eye of the soul, the eye of the heart. And we've talked about that the spiritual battlefield is the imagination. And I found this has been really helpful for people coming into orthodoxy or struggling with pornography or whatever the temptation is. Typically, it's lust and saying like you got to watch your thoughts. You have to watch the mental images because
Yeah,
everything begins there. And most people, before coming to Orthodox, they've never heard it articulated that way. That your imagination. I mean, where is it? It's not within space and time, and so we're able to contact the noetic entities of angels and demons there. But you have to be cautious of who you're contacting and what you're taking in. Could you
yeah,
speak a little bit to the logismy, the imagination, the spiritual warfare that
yeah,
occurs in the mind that people are not conscious of, but need to be more conscious of?
yeah. Well, the logis me, and is they're the thoughts. Okay, but most of our thoughts do not generate within us. See, we've we're we believe, and this is Freudian materialism just through the generations, we believe that we generate our own thoughts, but we don't. Most of our thoughts come in from the outside. Once you realize that is very freeing, because some of the thoughts are quite wretched and can be. All right? Things that on your own you would not imagine come into your mind. Because we believe that we generate our own thoughts, then we think, oh, well, I must really be a pervert, or I must really be twisted, right? And then you have this Calvinistic, kind of strain in the culture. It's still in the cultural ethos, right? Man is a wretched sinner, sinners in the hand of an angry God, and the whole forensic justification thing. That doesn't help. Okay, that just doesn't help. Most thoughts come in from the outside. Remember that. But the purification of the mind also starts with the purification of the heart. It's connected to the purification of the heart, because one of the great tragedies of the fall is the disconnection of the mind from the heart.
Mm-hmm.
And then we go through the Enlightenment, okay, and where all knowledge is obtained through the mind. That's the presupposition of the Enlightenment, right? That's crashing down around us. It's been a horrible failure, but we still kind of believe the presupposition.
Right.
When I was talking about, okay, giving up the porn and all that and starting the ascetical road, right? The mind clarifies. The mind is to be connected to the heart, because it is a noetic world, all right, but it's apprehended through the heart. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And we have to learn how to discipline our minds as well. You can't discipline the mind outside of prayer. Okay, you just can't. It'll run amok. Now, sometimes what'll happen is guys coming in and they'll really suffer with intrusive thoughts. I mean, they'll just be tortured by it. I understand how that happens. I understand the source and origin of it, but those thoughts, remember, come in from the outside.
Right.
In that case, I pray for them. I pray for them, and I pray the prayer of the evil eye, which is, I know some people are plugging their ears, but it's a light exorcism, okay? And sometimes I'll pray one of the softer exorcism prayers. Now, it doesn't mean they're possessed, but it does mean that there's hyperactive demonic activity taking place, and it'll take the prayer of a priest or another person to push that away. And it will. It'll clear up for them, and they'll have peace. Okay? And so when those things come, like Elder Paisios said this, St. Paisios now, he says, thoughts are like airplanes. You decide which ones land. But that's what he says. Yeah, he says, don't make your mind an airport. Right. But when we come in to Orthodoxy, I mean, we live in a really confused world, right? Especially concerning anthropology. What anthropology? It comes from the Greek anthropos. It means man, especially who and what man is. Most of us don't have a clue until we start coming into Orthodoxy, and then we're taught, and we're also taught the disciplines that we have to apply in order to heal from that confusion. All right. So the spiritual warfare is weak, is real. The demons will play on your weaknesses and vulnerabilities. But the best thing to do, guys, if you suffer with this, is go talk to your priest. Whatever makes manifest is light. That's what confession is. Mm-hmm. Everyone struggles with this. You're not the only one. Everyone struggles with this. And especially if you become Orthodox, because Orthodoxy is the antidote. It is the medicine, to spiritual healing. Now, with the mind and the heart, this is how the fathers describe it. The mind gives light. We learn and we see with the mind, but the light is always a reflected light. So the mind is like the sun, the mind is like the moon and the stars. The moon and the stars give light, and sometimes they give a lot of light. They can even show the path at night, but it's a reflected light. It's not the source of light, it's the reflected light of the sun.
Mm.
The light of the sun is apprehended by the heart. Blessed are the pure in heart. The nous, really, the nous. The nous is really the center of man, the center of the soul, the center of the heart. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And as you begin the path of purifying your heart, which you do with the Orthodox self-discipline, your
Right.
mind itself will become enlightened, and you will learn how to push away those thoughts.
Absolutely. And I can speak through my journey as an Orthodox Christian that has absolutely been the case. And getting back to the masculinity and the boundaries, it's that discipline of cleansing our noetic self through our actions first and foremost. And then what I've noticed in my own journey is that you become more sensitive to the places in which you fall. So I noticed when I first joined, okay, pornography, dealing and struggling, and then ending that habitual problem.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then you get that under control and you feel like you're doing pretty good, but as I believe, you get closer to Christ and he gives you new eyes to see, literally, as you said, the eye of the heart. You can see where you're coming up shorter in other areas that were kind of darkened. You weren't aware of it. And now you're
Mm-hmm.
becoming more aware of like all the other places in your life that you're falling short. And so it's this continual journey of cleansing the heart, cleansing your noetic faculties, and you actually begin to see the world itself more clearly.
Yes. Um, we were talking backstage, and sometimes, okay, a person is about to enter the church and moving towards their baptism, and all of a sudden the spiritual warfare gets intense,
Yes.
and they think I must be doing something wrong.
Yes.
Otherwise, I wouldn't be struggling with these sins so bad. I'm not fit to be baptized. That's demonic activity seeking to discourage you from getting baptized and to keep you out of the church. You know, when you're in the church, you get baptized, you are claimed by God. That's what happens. And that's why we read all the exorcism prayers at the making of a catechumen for your protection. Now, what you've got to do, guys, if this is happening to you, do not isolate. Whatever makes manifest is light. Go to your priest. If you've got a trusted friend and that's the only person you can go to your friend, but talk about this, because once you open the channel, God can speak to you. God can pour his grace into you. Go into prayer. But I understand sometimes that's hard to do when you're getting bombarded.
Right. Well, and as I mentioned to you, I've talked with a few people that um and it typically, and I don't want to, because this is the way that I came into the faith, was more intellectual. It was about learning about the theology, church history, and then becoming rationally convinced of the legitimacy of the Orthodox faith before I really developed actually spiritually, which was the whole point of it. But a lot of us
Mm-hmm.
young men are coming to the faith through intellectual means,
Yeah.
and they've put all these dots together. They've come to the correct conclusion, and now they kind of think that once we enter the church, things kind of get better. And that's not the case necessarily. And as you're saying, the temptations or the spiritual warfare heating up is quite normal. And in my own parish, and it's different experiences for different people. When I was brought in, the gentleman before me, who was much older, he's in his 50s, married, he had a beautiful experience. He saw what he believed was uncreated light. He was euphoric for days after his baptism. And for me, I felt like my temptations went up quite dramatically after being brought into the church, and that spiritually it was more difficult. And I've found through conversation that that seems to be the general case for much of the younger men that come into the church. Could you speak to what does the church mean when we say welcome to the arena? When people are brought into the church, and this whole phenomenon, as you're talking about, is the spiritual temptation, the spiritual warfare. It doesn't cease just because you're brought into the ark.
No, because spiritual warfare is a fact of life. So actually what you're doing is you're being ushered into reality. And so what has to go is this idea that comfort is the main goal.
Right.
That's what has to go. Okay. Now, when life was harder, we're a tremendously wealthy country. And we know physical comfort, but this is what some of the later elders have said. That the spiritual issues in the modern world will be primarily psychological.
Mm-hmm.
In the earlier world is we pray for the rain and we try and live through the drought and all that.
Right.
But what's happening, guys, when all of a sudden you're shaken up. It was the same for me too, by the way. I read every book there was in Orthodoxy. There's a lot more now than when I came in, but I read every book, right? And for me it was for an intellectual acceptance too. But of course we're all recovering materialists. I mean, this is why, this is why. It's the only reason why, right? This is the only path open to us until we come into church, and then that path broadens, and then we
Right.
learn about this other stuff. It's fine. It's just fine that it works that way. Just don't stop.
Right.
That's the main thing. But guys, yeah, it'll get worse. It can get worse. It's not going to crush you. It's not going to destroy you, but it is going to challenge your notion that once you do this, everything's going to be okay. Because life doesn't work that way. It
Right.
doesn't. I mean, I've been Orthodox now 40 years, something like that. And, and I've had a lot of rough times through it. But it's those rough times. See, it's those rough times that compel the growth. We
Right.
don't change unless we're compelled to change. We don't. So I've learned not to curse my sufferings and not to think I must be doing something wrong because I'm suffering, right? I've suffered in the priesthood. I've suffered in my Orthodox life, right? But I've learned that it's through that suffering that greater maturation occurs and experience builds.
Mm-hmm.
So don't be alarmed by that. And certainly do not think, because you will think this because we're trained to think this, I must be doing something wrong. I must be failing. God must not want me, right? These are things we have to dispose of. Now,
Right.
you talk to anybody who's got some years under their belt, some experience under the belt, they're going to tell you the exact same thing because we all went through it. Those experiences that I talked about at the beginning, they're cool stories, but they only happen out of struggle,
Right.
right? I'm not one that gets, angels don't visit me. Okay, the heavens have not opened. But I don't really want that. I want meaning.
Right.
I want understanding, right? And so that comes through struggle because the habits we've accrued or the categories we function in, sometimes the idols have to be destroyed. All
Right.
right? I call them false crutches,
Right.
dependencies, right? They got to go, man. They got to go. But when they go, what opens to you is the deeper power of God. That's what happens. And why it relates to manhood, guys, is because each man articulates in himself according to his own gifts, abilities, calling, um, he has to define for himself, with the help of God, what his role in this world is. And all men are different. No one can compel you. No one can force you. You have to come to a resolve in your own heart who you're going to, who you are. All right. Not that we take on identities, but really discover the who of who you are. And lots of times that comes through hardship. And then also what you're to do in this life. Now, this is something that we grow into. And if we seek Christ and put aside the grumbling, put aside the complaining, put aside that discontent, in all things give thanks to God, the Apostle Paul says, but also be in communion with your brother and with your priest, right? God himself will reveal it to you, but that revelation comes as you grow into it. That's how it happens. And the brotherhood is especially important because the brotherhood, your communion with your brothers, that communion creates the channel. That is the channel through which God's grace flows. God's grace is not amorphous. It doesn't float around in the energy like a radio wave. It doesn't.
Right.
No, it happens. It happens through communion with your brothers, through connection.
Well,
That's
and
how it
that
works.
leads me perfectly into where I wanted to take you next in regards to the Orthodox Church. Obviously, we're seeing a dramatic increase of young men converting. According to the OCA study that I saw, it was roughly around 80% of men under the age of 45 that were converting to the faith. That was for, I think, 2023. And then I recently saw something shared online that before 2020, and I don't know how accurate these numbers were, they said Orthodox Christianity was generally around 700 some thousand in the US. And in 2024, it was like 7.5 million. So Orthodoxy is seeing a dramatic increase here in the United States, but really all the Western nations. And I wanted to get your perspective on how Orthodoxy addresses many of the things that young men are struggling with. We mentioned identity, hopelessness, meaninglessness, and relationships both with women, but also with other men. I mean, there's recent studies that Gen Z and Gen Alpha, which is the youngest generation, that they are the most isolated and have the smallest social circles of previous generations. Could you speak to how the church and the way it functions due to God's will actually answers and addresses many of these different things? Could be identity, could be meaning, again, as you're talking about the discipline of the ascetic lifestyle of Orthodox Christianity, and relationships. Could you speak to that?
Yeah. So, is your question is like, what does what do the fathers, the teachers teach about it, or what's happening in the actual parish?
What's happening in the actual parish for let's say a young man who's 23 years old, doesn't know what he's supposed to do with his life, doesn't have a lot of friends, doesn't have a sense of identity, feels hopeless about the economy, the state of the world, him being able to be a functioning adult and have a house, have a family, and his lack of relationships. The Orthodox Church, I believe, offers answers to these, especially through the participation in the parish life. But if you want to go into the Father, however you want to address it, but how do you see the church being a refuge for these young men dealing with these problems of the nihilistic and secular world?
Well, I think the church isn't doing the job it should be. It could be doing better, much better. Okay, that's what I believe. That's not an indictment. It's just to say that I don't think that the church is really prepared for the influx that's coming. Not only here, but that's coming. This is just the beginning. I'm convinced of it. I saw this happening. I saw this coming 6 years ago. I just saw it coming. Yeah, yeah. And I would tell the priests in my deanery, this is coming, get ready. And they would kind of listen and dismiss it. I told my bishop, he kind of looked at me like, well, yeah, maybe. And here it is. Here it is.
Yep.
Okay. And so I've got another prediction. This is just the beginning. All right. I think that Orthodoxy, if we are faithful to this, will become the ground for the rebuilding of culture. Which is going to have to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know when the end of the world is. I don't know any of that. Okay. But I do know that this culture is fracturing in so many places, and it needs to be rebuilt. Okay. It needs to be rebuilt. And I think that the young men coming into this church, they're going to heal up, and they're going to be critical in that rebuilding. That's what I believe.
How can
you
the
guys
church better accommodate? You're saying they're falling short. How can the church be better if service for these young men?
They have to understand the world they're coming out of, and they don't.
And I would agree that your voice, and I would also put Father Josiah Trinum, are some of the few voices that actually speak directly to the things that young men are struggling with.
Yeah, because we see it. We see it. Yeah, and I'm going to keep speaking, and I think what's going to happen is that other priests kind of sense this, and I think the priests that I really have a calling for this, like Father Josiah, myself, and then others, I think that they're going to start speaking to it. They're going to see what I'm describing. I think it's a remarkable thing. Look, my time horizon extends beyond my own death. Okay, I'm building for the next generation. I used to be culture warrior, like I said, not disparaging that at all, and I was pretty good at it. But then I saw that the problem was much deeper. Okay, I'm gonna work on that deeper level, because if I can strengthen the guys coming in, and I can bring them healing, it's God who brings them healing, but I do get a lot of this stuff. I do understand it, right? Just imagine what the church is going to be 20 years from now. Let's get this stuff straightened out now, right?
Right.
Let's do our work now. Just imagine what you're going to be like, not you, but everybody 10 years from now.
Right.
Okay. And then, because ideally, in each generation, the church strengthens. They learn from their teachers, but they should surpass their teachers. And the times are such that we are at such a critical period that the necessity for strengthening men and thus strengthening culture is self-evident. It's self-evident. It really is. So what can the church do? Well, what I can tell you what I'm doing is build brotherhoods. I think that if we can, to build a brotherhood addresses this abject loneliness that just crushes men. Men see their weakness, they just don't know how to get out of it, right? They see the lies, but they don't know how to defend themselves against them. It's so overpowering, right? And so what they need is communities of men on the same journey, and they need guides and teachers to tell them how it's done. That's what I think the church needs to become. So the brotherhood part of it is very, very important. And this idea is really gaining traction all over the country. Now, what's happening down here, you've had Father Paul Georges,
Yes.
And we think alike in a lot of ways. And we work together very closely. I'm in Fort Myers, he's in Naples. But we have a community of men here that's just growing, and it's becoming an indigenous community, right? They move closer to the churches. They see each other socially. It can't be found in the world anymore. It just can't be found. So they find it with each other. And I think that it's kind of a Benedict option thing, but we're not running off to the monasteries and buying property there. We're doing it in the city. That's what I think the future is. And again, let's go back to ontology again. It's what I said, and this is really important. Men, you got to have brotherhood. You have to have connection with other men, because it's through that. See, the nature of God's love is paternal, because he's Father. So when you're helping your brother, you're fathering your brother, is what's happening. When the brother being helped is being fathered, that's what the relationship is between men. So we challenge, we upbuild, okay? We do those things, and you will become stronger, and you will strengthen other men as you do this. This is the basis of real community, real brotherhood, real fellowship. And when the men become strong, so will the families.
Right.
That's what'll happen. Now, we've had some marriages that has happened. I've seen a lot of healing, in guys' lives. There's nothing more strong than the love of a brother. That is what affects the healing in ourselves and in our neighbors. So in your answer to the church, I don't think the church, I think overall it's kind of late to the party, but they couldn't have foreseen this.
Right.
Okay, nobody foresaw it until it happened, right? So let's give it a little time. But having said that, too, some of the stuff that's being created, your program, Father Just, there's a lot out there. Jonathan Paisios, I mean, it's just a whole. Jay does really remarkable work. I wish his podcasts weren't so long, because I mean, his videos weren't so long, because then I could listen to him. But his work is really good.
Yeah.
Some of these guys I'm friends with, Deacon Ananias.
Yep.
That's really phenomenal stuff, and it's out of kind of the normie groove. It has to be, because the normie groove is just, there's no life there anymore. There's just no life.
No, I think it's amazing how much Orthodoxy has as an online presence, given the demographic numbers. I mean, when it comes to online Christian apologetics, I mean, Orthodoxy is let's say 1% of the American population, maybe more, but roughly speaking, and yet the content of all these different content creators, I think it's incredibly powerful, and a lot of the young men consume information through video.
Yes, I mean, everybody who comes in, I just don't even ask. I just ask. Now when they come in, I say, well, who are you watching on YouTube? Because then I know what neighborhood they're coming out of, right? And then they read the books.
I want to. You were talking about brotherhood, and I had a question that come up. A gentleman that was at the men's retreat that you spoke at in Indiana, Wood Floor Alchemist, said, "Father Hans, I've been hugging and even kissing the men at our parish since you're talking indie, and they are not receptive." Yeah. Laughy face. The anti-male intimacy runs deep in our culture.
Yeah.
And I wanted you to bring up the point that you were making in regards to the over-sexualization of our culture, and the homosexual LGBTQ agenda. One of the things that you brought up in your speech was that it's actually hampered male relationships with each other.
Yeah. Men can't hug
it. A little bit to that.
Yeah. I mean, the kiss of peace. Look at the icon of Peter and Paul. What are they doing? They're kissing each other, right? Hugging each other, showing being affectionate. I have my brotherhood tonight, and we're going through St. John Chrysostom's essay on brotherhood. St. Paul, this is Chrysostom. St. Paul also tells us the reason why we should love one another, saying, show with affection your brotherly love for others. Romans 12:10. He wants to say, this is Chrysostom, you are brothers, and therefore you should have brotherly love between you. So the brotherly love between you, you show, it's an affection. Call it that. Okay, call it that. It's not abstract. You really love your brother. You really feel for your brother. You can feel his love for you. Show it through affection. So you give him a hug. You give
Right.
him a kiss. What I'll do is I'll give him a kiss on the forehead. I started that here. And there was that resistance at first. There was that resistance. Where does that resistance come from? It comes because of the homosexualization of their culture, brands any show of affection between men as homosexual.
Right.
It's not. It's not. And so that, I call it Gay Inc., Gay Incorporated. That's what I call it. And it's got a huge propaganda arm. That might be changing now because there's been a culture shift at the recent election. People
Right.
are really getting tired of that.
Right.
And but we've been inculcated with the propaganda. And then, oh, if I give my brother a hug, is he going to think I'm gay?
Right. Or even
Right?
telling, I've found even lifelong friends, people I don't see much anymore, just telling them that I love them. There's a tinge of being afraid of being perceived as, being a bit effeminate or homosexual or gay just by telling your male friends that you love them, and
Yeah.
it shouldn't be that way.
Yeah. Now, see, the other side of it is, and we won't get into any great detail, but why is homosexuality on the upswing? Because of this deep need that men have for brotherhood. That's why. That's why. If there was real brotherhood and real connection with men, then the homosexual issue wouldn't be as prominent as it is. In fact, it could be healed. It could be healed. Now,
Do
that's a
you
whole other issue, and the polemicists and the ideologues will have my throat. But I'm telling you the truth.
right. I mean,
Okay.
but there's even scientific research on sexual trauma, especially regarding male homosexuality,
Hmm.
in early ages in one's life, or things that occurred the first time a male had an orgasm that creates some sort of sexual imprinting.
Hmm.
And as the church, and I'd be curious if you'd speak on this. I mean, homosexuality is a sort of or any sort of aberrant sexuality that isn't between a man and a wife in marriage, is a form of fetishism. And do you believe that, and that it's a sort of a sexualized fetish for male companionship?
Yeah. I approach it differently,
Okay.
um, but I would say yes. But I have a more therapeutic approach in the her father Metropolitan Horotheos Vlachos sense of that
Okay.
term. Okay, if there's same-sex attraction there, or if any other kind of, say, sexual aberration in a person's life, it's rooted in trauma. It's rooted in trauma. Nobody desires this. They feel the desire, but the desire has an origin. It could be being sexually abused, sometimes being exposed to pornography too young, um, um, is traumatic. Okay, sometimes sexual experimentation when you're young can be traumatic. All these things. I prefer to heal the trauma. That's the way I approach it.
Hmm.
Because see, those things are compulsive. The guy doesn't want to feel this, right? He doesn't want to feel this, but yet he feels it. He feels his aberrant desires. Okay. He doesn't want to feel it. He doesn't choose it, but they have a source and origin. The source and origin of any kind of compulsion is trauma. And so let's heal the trauma. That's the way I approach it.
And could you speak to the in regards to healing the trauma? We've already kind of hinted at Christ being the physician of souls and the church being a hospital. What are some of the ways in which life in the church can begin this healing process of this fragmented soul, as you were talking about? Our culture's fragmented, and this is obviously causing a spiritual problem on people emerging out of these cultures. That we
Yeah.
ourselves are fragmented in serious ways.
Yeah. Well, in the case, first of all, you got to go to church. You have to be in the liturgy. Okay. You have to go to confession. This is assuming you're all, after baptism.
Right.
Although sometimes the healing occurs pre-baptism too, because it's a healing of ontology. It's a healing of the human person. Okay.
Right.
So some of this healing can occur before baptism. And you've got to receive communion. All right. Now, how do we heal trauma? Is that what you're asking me?
Yes.
Okay. Trauma is stored in the body. Okay. And it's stored in the cell. Every cell has a memory component to it. Now, the cells of the brain record the narrative of the event, but the actual trauma is sentient. The pain, the anguish, things you feel, that's sentient. Okay, so that's in your body, and that's where the trauma is stored. Where is it stored? It is stored in the memory. Okay, now what you try and do is you don't have to know the details of the trauma, but just if you really listen to a person, they'll tell you, right? They'll tell you what it is. And when they're ready, you go into prayer for them and you pray the healing prayers. And the one who heals the trauma is St. John Maximovich. He has the gift of the healing of trauma. And the prayers that are read with St. John's inexplicable, mysterious gift that he has, which we see the effects of, but it's hard to understand how it really works. The memory can be healed, okay, which is to say, the memory can be restored to its pre-traumatic state. Once that happens, the memory that used to trigger the cells, the sentient part of our experience, right, that would trigger the cells, and then would trigger the compulsive behaviors, which arose as a way to ameliorate the pain of the trauma, as well as the fear of deep existential isolation, because those are the two components that constitute trauma, right? They are moved. The behaviors are moved from compulsion. The energy driving the compulsion is removed. We've vaporized that nuclear reactor, is what we've done, right? So the behaviors then, instead of being compulsively driven, now move to the level of volition and then become subject to orthodox ascetical self-discipline. Okay. And then the fear, see, when you're traumatized, part of trauma is that, especially when you're a child, and if you're traumatized you're always traumatized by someone who's not always, but usually someone that you love and trust. Part of that trauma is the fear of being existentially isolated. It's a hell. It's a foretaste of hell, an outer darkness that the child can't bear. So it all gets buried. And that's those behaviors grow up around it as a way to stave off the pain of that whenever it arises in present time. So in other words, if anything in present time replicates the context or environment of the initial trauma, it'll threaten to come up. And that's when the compulsive behaviors kick in. So what you actually do through prayer, you enter into the memory and you heal the memory. This is because memory is fundamentally a language function. Okay? And words penetrate both the unseen and the seen. Okay? It's a word that brought creation into existence. God spoke. And God said, let there be light. The word today, the word of God today has as much potency as that primordial word, but it's the word of redemption. It redeems the creation already created, and the creation becomes redeemed through the redemption of man. Okay, the whole creation groans and travails, waiting for the manifestation of the sons of God, the Apostle Paul says in the book of Romans. Because man is the steward of the creation. That's what to be steward means. And as man's heart turns to God, then creation finds its proper ordering. And it begins in man because our bodies come from the dust. Okay, they come from the dust, and our souls, of course, are given to us by the breath of God, which is to say that they're open to the energies and life of God. That's what it means when it says man became a living soul. So what you're doing is you're taking this word, this redemptive word, which are really the prayers of the fathers. I just read them from the priest's handbook, prayers of healing, right? I mean,
Right.
there's no need to reinvent the wheel here, right? That came to me once when I was in the hospital. I go, I'm reading these ancient prayers, but that proves their efficacy.
Right.
I mean, they would have fallen into disuse.
Right.
But we're still reading them now, right? So you pray that and ask St. John to direct this word. We have to say the word because the word is the creative. That's where the creative contains the creative potency of God, the Spirit of God, right? That brings a healing. And ask St. John to bring him to the place where the trauma exists. It's usually in places of chronic pain in the body, by the way.
That leads me into another question. I didn't plan on it, but could you speak? Because I know for a lot of Protestant converts to Orthodoxy, the veneration and praying to saints for them to pray for you, just like we ask people, our friends and our parents to pray for us. I know that it's often lost on them, but even for myself, I found that it really took me a year or two to get into a habit of praying to my patron saint in the Theotokos. Praying to the Holy Trinity is pretty straightforward. I would, grew up Protestant, so that wasn't difficult. But could you speak a little bit? Because something that's come up throughout this conversation and in the speech you gave is Saint Paisios, Saint John Maximovich, Saint Maximus the Confessor, Saint John Chrysostom. Could you speak to the life of the Orthodox Christian, of the brotherhood and the utilization of the saints?
Well, Metropolitan Horotheos Vlachos, I just reread his small book, says that the healing and all that happens in cooperation with the saints. Okay, so here's how I see it. Now, this is just my deal. Okay, I don't know if it's how accurate it is, but it makes a lot of sense. You really saw the spirit and power in the apostles. Okay, then the apostles passed, and then you saw it in the bishops. The bishops of the early church had incredible power. Well, where is it today? It's in the saints. That's where it is. All right. And so he says that the healing and the work in the world occurs through the saints. That's how God is redeeming the world and us. And us. Okay. But this work of redemption, it's not a metaphor. It's a real transformation of creation. It's a metamorphosis. It really is. It's being brought back to the kingdom. And we're not only a journey, but we're co-creators with Christ in our life. And one day all things will be reconciled, and the way the creation was in Eden, it will be in the kingdom of God, because they're both fundamentally the same place. So those who have gone before from this life into the next, they have not left us. They have not left us. They're here. This is why our churches are filled with icons. Now, I understand what you're saying, because for me, it didn't, like, I was one of these guys that read all the books and this and that, and I had absolutely no intellectual problem with it at all. But here, my heart didn't quite get it yet.
Right.
But it comes with you. It's given to you as a gift as you persevere and grow. And with me, what happened was I was in Greece. I've been Orthodox for a while, and then I became a priest. And after 2 years, I went to Greece to learn Greek and live there. It's one of the best experiences I've had. But where it happened was, it's just so intimidated and what am I doing here and all that stuff, right? But there was an American deacon there and married a Greek girl, and he was basically a Greek now culturally. And he said, well, let's go to a monastery. And I didn't know. I knew about venerating relics theoretically.
Mm-hmm.
No intellectual problem at all, but I never venerated a relic. And so we go into this monastery, and they bring out the relics of the 40 martyrs of Sevastopol for us to venerate. And I whispered to him real quick, I don't know what to do. And he says, okay, just follow me. He went first. He says, do what I do. And, you bow, you make your cross, you bow. And I did all that. And I come into the presence of the relic, and I felt palpable holiness in the presence of those relics. And at that point, there was like a shift in me. My faith went from here to here, to the heart. And I started seeing with the heart. But that was a number of years after I was Orthodox. It just takes a little while.
Mm-hmm.
That's all. That's all. And so when the new guys hear this, okay, you're hearing about things you have not yet experienced. Okay, but learn about them anyway. God is good, right? God will use you and all that. Okay, but your journey is one of unfathomable spiritual depth. And we get there step by step by step.
Right. The last one or next to the last one, I got two more questions and then we'll
Okay.
wrap up. I know that you have to get going here soon, so
Yeah.
I'll make it quick. But
Okay.
if you could speak to, you've already talked about the power of the word, and I think for people coming out of the new age and some of that stuff, like the books like The Secret, where you kind of, the whole spirituality of manifestation.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak to the power of stating our goals and intentions and utilizing the power of the word, but also not falling victim to a sort of self worship of your own desires and trying to manifest your life,
Yeah.
and how that relates to so many young men entering the church that, like you said, don't know what they're going to do with their life, don't know what their goals are, don't know who they are, want to get married, but maybe they don't really have any experience with women or girlfriends. Um, what's your advice for young men in trying to decipher their own lives and their path forward in relationship to God and the church?
Well, I would say, first of all, you got to have brotherhood, okay? Because you're not going to be able to figure out your own life. It comes in communion with your brother, comes in communion with your priest. It comes in communion with other men. You don't find, you find yourself in your neighbor. That's the truth. But what does that mean? It's a beautiful thing, but what does that mean? You'll learn. You'll learn as you open up to other men and develop friendships and relationships with them. Real brotherhood. I would say you start there.
Okay.
All right. You really start there. Most of us, and this was me too, when I came into the church, come in with a real deficit of manly love and real healthy, vigorous, manly companionship. I mean, I had friends, but we were all in the same boat, basically. All right, just coming out of the culture. The culture wasn't that different than it is now, but now it's worse. Okay,
Yeah.
now it's worse. It's more intense. You start there, and then what's going to happen is you're going to be challenged because Orthodoxy will challenge you, and it's going to challenge you to become a better man, and you know we're habituated to either rebel against that or or just to reject it outright. Okay, and you're going to be challenged. Okay, you want a wife, but are you really ready for one? Are you really ready for one? Or is there work that you have to do in your own life first that'll make you a better and stronger man? By the way, I'll tell you what women are attracted to is a man who's confident in his own masculinity. Just like the real attractiveness of a woman is not necessarily her outward looks, it's her own sense of femininity.
Mm-hmm.
That's what attracts a man. A man is attracted to femininity. Okay, and a woman who's confident in her own femininity, not the outward thing, you know, big boobs and all that, but the inward thing. But it's the same with a woman for a man. A woman likes a man who's confident and secure. So are you unconfident? Are you insecure? Well, then we got to work on that. That stuff has to get healed up first, guys. And then when you do get married, you'll be a stronger man in that marriage, which means a better husband and a better father.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so you will be challenged to grow up. Okay, that's one of the prerequisites. You got to grow up. Now, I'm not wagging my finger. I never wag my finger. Okay, but the truth is that masculinity has been under attack. Yeah, and it's painful and it's horrible, and all that's true. But sometimes we coddle ourselves and baby ourselves too, and we don't rise up to the challenge. But I'll tell you, you got to rise up to the challenge because men are created to rise up to challenges. Now, getting the thing about the word in that, honestly assess where you are and what you need, and then go for it. Now, the first step in go for it is to declare that this is what I'm going to do, not that this is what I want to do. We already know what you want to do. This is what I'm going to do, and you say it. You say it. You know, when I'm dealing with guys, especially if they're dealing with some like sexual habits and stuff like that, sometimes what happens when they're 13, 14 years old, you know, they kind of chose a particular aberration as a form of rebellion, and they made an inner vow. And that comes back into their memory as we're working on, as he's trying to clean up his life. And I said, did you make a vow? I'll ask him, did you make a vow? He said, I'm going to do this because I'm going to rebel against my parents. I'm going to rebel against society or whatever it is. I understand why the kid rebels. I understand that, but it doesn't work anymore when you're an adult. And I'll have him repudiate the vow. I say, you got to say it out loud. I repudiate that vow. And I make him say it 3 times. Because once you say something, that's the very first step of bringing it into existence.
Right.
That's and you say, and you concretely say the goal. You don't say, I want to do this. You know, I was telling you about, you know, the guy earlier, Jeremiah's brother. Well, he went back to college, and you know, and I said, well, what grades are you going to get? He's a real capable guy. I knew he'd get A's, and he says, well, I'm going to try for an A or B. And I said, that's not my question. My question is, what grades are you going to get? And he stopped and he paused. A's, he said, and he got the A's. So he did that every semester. And he got the A's. This is how you overcome the stuff, guys. And this is coming to me as I'm talking. A lot of guys think that you can't overcome. I'm telling you, you can. You're sons of the living God.
Right.
Okay? You can overcome. I can feel it. Well, that's for the next guy. That's not for me. No, it's for you. It's for you.
And as you speak, somebody in the chat says, "Well, isn't this the sin of ambition?" And I've found this even when Father Turbo and Father Moses, when we were talking about the need to find a career as an Orthodox man and make money to provide for your family, there was pushback. Well, isn't that too worldly of a concern for an Orthodox Christian to be so focused on making money? Could you speak to this fine line between obsessive of one's ambitions or goals and actually becoming a man of God?
Well, you got to make something of yourself. Okay? There's no virtue in passivity. Okay? And there's no virtue in not doing what God put you on this world to do and doing it well. All right? And so, is that ambitious? Well, be ambitious for the right virtues. That's what it is. Be ambitious for the every man should have in himself the drive to excel. It's just what do you drive towards the acquisition of virtue. And providing well is a virtue. Because man was created to create. Man was created to provide. Man was created to protect. Now, you get your ego wrapped up in that. God is faithful to humble you if you need to be humbled. All right? Just wait. Just wait.
It always does.
But if you want to, this is what the Father said, if you want to avoid the big humbling, take the small indignities that come. Just take them, the small humblings. If you take the small humblings, then you won't have a big humbling because you'll hold the pride in check. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
But the guys who say this, it sounds like I am kind of refuting you, but I'm explaining it more. Go to the monasteries. See how hard these men work. See what kind of churches they build. See how they cultivate their olive trees. All right? It's all top-notch, excellent work. And they would not do anything less.
Absolutely.
Okay? That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a virtue. I'm talking about a virtue. And this virtue is expressed whether you live in the city or you live in the monastery. I hope that explains it.
Yeah, no, I think it does. And what you're highlighting is the correct orientation towards the goals, but a man pursuing excellence, especially given the talents that God's bestowed him with, that is not something to be discredited as being a worldly pursuit. If it's like you said about your ego or about the idea that you've existentially done all these things and that you've made this happen outside the blessings of God, yeah, I could see where that's going to get problematic. But what you're hitting at is what I think is also true: is every man is driven by a pursuit of excellence with the destiny and journey that God's put before him.
Think about the parable of the 10 talents. The man who was given 5 talents had to give 5 talents back, 100%. That equals 100%. He gave back what he got. The man who was given 2 talents had to give back 2, 100%. You got to give back what you've been given to God in its fullness. The guy who hid his talents, oh, I was afraid. I was afraid. Here, I'm giving it back to you, God. He was sent to hellfire. Wow. Think about that parable. Whoa, that's rough. Well, he didn't fulfill his destiny. He didn't fulfill the purpose for which he was created.
And so the last thing, and you can make it as short as sweet as you'd like. And I know you got to get out of here, but
Yeah.
the end of the title of the stream was "Becoming a Man of God," and I wanted you just to end with a point of what is an Orthodox man of God.
An Orthodox man of God. The glory of God is a man fully alive. Who was that? Saint somebody in the early centuries. The glory of God is a man fully alive. Become the man that God created you to be. And that is defined as the acquisitions of virtues. I don't care what your career is, it doesn't matter. As long as you are working hard, taking care of your family, working to the best of your ability, supporting your church, living the Orthodox life, do that, and your life will be blessed. And that's being a man of God. That's being a man of God. Make your calling and vocation sure. The Apostle Paul says the calling is the calling to become a son of God, and your vocation is how you live it. Okay, I can't get any more specific than that because it's particular to every man, because every man has different gifts and abilities. And the calling conforms to the gifts and abilities that God has given you, but you have to make your vocation sure. You have to step forward and you have to determine it, and then you have to live it out. Okay? So for me, becoming a man of God is always action. It's always action. It's always growth, deeper growth into Christ, which is, it's synonymous. Find Christ, you find yourself, you find Christ, right? But that whole journey has no end because God himself is infinite. And we're to be co-creators with Christ here, but I am convinced that continues after our journey on this earth as well.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Father. We just had a few super chats. I was going to announce those real quick. The Cheap Chimp throws in $5, says hit that like. Thank you very much. Vigo says, bless you, Father Jacobse and DPH. Christos Anesti. Thank you.
Alithos Anesti. Go ahead.
And DM312 said, shout out to Father Hans Diego from ASI 4.2.
Yes. All right. All right.
And then the last one was Justin Hintley sent in a generous $20, no comment over on Dono Chat. So that's going to conclude the stream. Father, thank you so much for taking the time today. I know you're very busy. I do appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Go ahead.
I say my pleasure. I've enjoyed it a lot, actually.
Yeah, I thought this was a great conversation. I was hoping for an hour and a half, but once we get going, 2 hours, it's hard to stop. So I do appreciate you being generous with your time. God bless you, and hopefully we can do it again in the future.
Okay, God bless you too.
All right. I will see you guys all next time. That should be probably Sunday. I'll be going over the book, The Deification of Man. So we'll be talking a little bit about Orthodox theology on Sunday, and I will see you then. As always, until then, God bless.